Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Welcome back to the Tech Ed Podcast. I am Matt Kirkner. We say right in our intro every week that we love people who are innovating and disrupting and doing new things in the world of technical education. When we think about that world and that idea of disruption, what do we mean by disruption? We mean people who are thinking in totally new ways, have an absolute vision for where they want to go, and that vision is totally separate from the status quo, totally separate from what people are used to. So being a disruptor takes vision. It also takes a tremendous amount of tenacity, because there is always going to be somebody who tells you that something won't work. But if you believe in that idea, if you believe strongly in a new way of doing things and you're tenacious about getting there, it is amazing what can happen. So several weeks ago, I'm on a trip through rural North Dakota, eastern end of North Dakota, and I have an opportunity to meet the leader of an amazing school district. Dr. Cory Steiner is the superintendent of the Northern Cass School District. And believe me, this is a school district, when we say in the middle of nowhere, this is in the middle of nowhere, but they are absolutely disrupting technical education in general and education as a whole. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Cory Steiner to the Tech Ed Podcast. Cory, awesome to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, Matt, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be with you, and just loved our conversation the other day and can't wait to talk today.
That's the reason you're back. I was like, this is a gentleman that absolutely has to tell his story and the story of his district to the Tech Ed Podcast audience, which is why I'm so very happy, Cory, that you're here. But, I kind of teed up Northern Cass a little bit in the introduction, but, I know you can do a much better job than I did of telling our audience, what is it about your community that makes it unique? Where is it? What makes us special? Familiarize us with Northern Cass.
Yeah, so Northern Cass, we're about 25 to 30 miles northwest of Fargo, North Dakota. And for North Dakota, that's as metro as it gets. And Matt, you're right. When we say middle of nowhere, if you were out there right now, you would see corn starting to sprout up around all four sides of our building. We serve 6 really small communities, no essential services in those communities. We're one building, pre-K through 12, 700 learners, growing like crazy. And just really unique, because we tell people we're going to provide a big school opportunity in a small school environment. We're going to know your mom and your dad and grandpa and grandma, and we're going to know your kid very well. And we're going to give them the opportunities they would get in big school districts. And we're going to do it in a manner that allows that learner to change the world. And we're really proud of that.
Allowing a learner to change the world. I mean, that is a big goal, right? But it's something that you're absolutely doing. And as you and I talked, Cory, when we were together recently, and as you know, I had a struggle in the traditional education model as a student. I could never sit still. I could never pay attention. The one-to-many model did not work for me. It does for some. It did not work for me. One-to-many, meaning a teacher standing in front of the classroom, lecturing to a group of 25 students, and writing on a chalkboard and then sending us away with a worksheet. I really struggled learning in that fashion. I know you have some of those similar, I won't call them frustrations, but maybe questions about that traditional education model. How, in your opinion, Cory, does the traditional model of education miss the mark in terms of creating this next generation of learners?
It's certainly not because people aren't working hard or people aren't trying, but the issue is we're in a world that changes exponentially. Just from the innovation of the smartphone to the ability to connect with anyone, anywhere, at any time, the world just isn't the same from day in to day out. And if we're going to continue to educate kids in a model that, we all know is 150 years old, we're going to lose a generation of kids. We're not going to give them the skills they need to be able to be the next generation of leaders in this nation. And that's ultimately what we should be charged with doing. It's not just about getting them in the workforce. It's getting them into the workforce to design the next set of jobs, to design the next set of leaders. The job we have right now, I think we're at a point in history where If we don't do something, we may lose, like I said, a generation of learners. And I think that what that'll cost this country may be something we can never recover.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. If we don't disrupt the educational model in certain ways, we are going to lose a generation of learners and quite possibly the United States of America as we know it, because to your point, it is a much different place. But I think those core values of things like lifelong learning, of education, of preparing people for whatever comes next, those certainly have been part of and a goal of traditional education. But what has worked in the past, to your point, over the course of 150 years, or as somebody put it to me not long ago, if you look at the American classroom, it looks not too much different today than it did 70 years ago. And this is during a time where, to your point, everything has changed in terms of the way we gather information, the way that we process information, the access we have to each other, the access that we have to data. Everything is being totally transformed. And because of that, I think you and I agree that the world of education needs to be transformed in a positive light, certainly not disruption for the sake of disruption, but with a much greater goal. And this was when you and I were talking within about 2 or 3 sentences, Cory, I was like, oh my goodness, this model is truly disruptive. Tell the story of what education looks like today in Northern Cass.
Yeah, and it's certainly it's been a story of resilience and perseverance. It's been a story of risk taking and the valuing of innovation. And it was about 5 years ago. And really, ultimately, what we realized is, yeah, our kids were going to 4-year colleges, and that was our success metric at that time. And any kid that didn't go into college was looked at as a failure. And for people that love kids and went into this for the right reason, we couldn't reconcile that. And so we said, well, what if we started to look at it from the model of being choice ready? College, career, and military, and we give every kid every chance to have their first choice. And people thought, yeah, that's a good idea. And we said, but we understand we're going to have to tear down a system that's by all accounts and means successful and start all over, and that's going to be really hard work. And people said, well, if it's good for kids, then why wouldn't we do that? And so we did. We started and we tore down a really successful system. And we went to a model where we personalize instruction, where we build learner agency. We give a lot of voice and choice to our learners and our educators. We allow learning to take place and get credit outside the building, because that learning is as important as what goes on inside the walls. We give kids internships like crazy, because I don't need them on our campus to prove that they're learning and can be ready when they walk out of our building. We let kids control pace of their learning. Yeah, there's still some deadlines because that's part of life, but we've really truly went from a model that was about adult preference to one that is completely and totally becoming learner-centered.
And when you and I talk, Cory, you gave an example, and I'd love for you to share it, where your students can literally sit down with an advisor, if I understood you correctly, looking at the state standard, looking at what's required of a student going through, for instance, a traditional high school pathway. What are we expecting them to be able to do? What standard are we holding them to? And create their own, almost help create their own learning environment and their own process to get there. Go into a little more depth about that.
Yeah, so we've started a couple different things, but I think the one that you and I talked a lot about is what we call our studio experience. And honestly, we had some kids come to us and say, I don't want to learn in the traditional manner. I want something different. I want to own more of my learning than you're even allowing us to. And so we said, all right, what standards do you want to hit? And they go through and they pick the standards, and then we co-design the learning experience with them. And the key point is there, it's co-design. And the teacher becomes a facilitator of learning. They ask questions, they pose questions, they give guidance, but the learner is dictating where they're going to go and how they're going to get there. Their pathway is their pathway. It becomes our job to be a resource. And in literally just a year of us doing that, we have seen some of the most remarkable results in terms of products created, but more importantly, of learners figuring out who they are as a person and as a human being. And again, it's purely giving them the power, and us as adults giving up control and being okay with that.
And you, if I recall correctly, you even had one student that was running his own small business during part of his school day, correct? And actually using the lessons that he's learning as part of running that business and tying them back to the standard. Do I remember that right?
Yeah. It was one of our young lady learners. She developed her own ceramics glaze and then created ceramics and then was creating an online store. She was also selling it at school. And we're like, well, that's amazing. Not only are you hitting art standards, you're hitting math standards. You're also hitting personal finance standards. Like that's just a beautiful opportunity. And even since you and I've talked, we've got a host of other kids that now have started selling some of the works they're creating and said like they're just so excited about this opportunity to show who they are as a young person and to get the respect that we probably have been given our kids in terms of understanding they can do more than we've ever probably realized.
Absolutely. You think about what they're learning through that process and how completely disruptive that process is. I just think to myself, where was that model of independence, of hands-on learning, of kind of coming up with your own ideas when I was going through school? I think I probably would have been a much, much better student. Like any disruption, Cory, you can't just look at a roadmap and say, oh, this is how I disrupt an education model. If it's already been proven, by definition, it's not disruption. So somebody had to come up with this. Somebody had to devise this new way of learning and this new model of learning. Who on your team was responsible for that?
One, I will tell you honestly, this has been a full model, full movement by our staff. We don't talk consensus. We don't vote on anything. We talk about commitment. Are we going to commit to doing what's best for our learners? Because we also have the belief if we do what's best for learners, that's usually pretty darn good for us as adults. So one of our people, our director of personalized learning, Tom Clapp, was really instrumental in saying, like, I think we can redesign the whole school around this idea of agency and being learner-centered. And from that, Tom and a variety of other people over the years, a lot of our educators have now helped us build a very fluid model that I will tell people never ends. When you're doing disruption, you better be prepared for the fact that pit in your stomach will never go away because there's no arrival point, because every set of kids is different and every day is different. So that means the system has to be agile enough to be able to change and be able to meet the needs of not only the kids, but the educators that come in new as well.
We talk about life being a journey, and it just occurred to me in the way that you answered that question, Cory, that disruption is a journey as well. It's not a destination. It's not completing the sandcastle or reaching that point of nirvana where everything's perfect. If you're a disruptor, that's a lifelong commitment because you have to continue to disrupt the model, especially when you're doing it in the way that you are, where you're trying to create these unique, customized learning experiences for every new class of students that's coming through your school. So lots and lots of work on that continual disruption. I want you to walk in a little bit for us. What does this feel like to be a student? Tell us about the typical day for a student at Northern Cass, and how might that feel different from a student learning in a more traditional environment?
Yeah, and we always tell people we were brave before perfect, and there's still a lot of work left to do. So you would still see what we call, is unfortunate, a traditional schedule that this year is what we're going after. In that we're going to study and we're going to figure out a better schedule to provide more time for engagement and passion and more time for educators to collaborate. But ultimately, what I think you would see is you're going to see learners that enter a learning center, and immediately you're going to see them being given choice. You're going to see them engaging in reflection, and you're going to see a really hard focus around our portrait of a learner. We don't call it portrait of a graduate because portrait of a learner means every kid in our building. Of those skills, you will see that they know exactly where they're at in their learning in terms of proficiency. And then you will also see they're given lots of opportunities to figure out what pathway is going to be best for them to achieve their goal, whether it's their goal in that learning or their goal overall. You'll still see some direct instruction because I tell people, like, lecture, there's nothing wrong with lecture. It's bad lecture. That's the problem. But it's small little bits of that happens where it's needed. But then you'll also see our learners getting a lot of coaching, which is small group and conferencing one-on-one time. The model that you talked about that wasn't successful for myself either, of 1 to 25, that's a very rare occurrence in our building. So our instructional model has completely shifted in the time that I've been there.
And what are your students telling you about this experience now that you're 4 or 5 years in and you've got entire cohorts of students that have gone through, 3, 4, 5 years of this experience? What kind of feedback are you getting?
So I have a learner advisory council that my dean of learners, Sam Johnson, and I run. And we meet with them every month and we ask these questions. And they've been instrumental, from being terrified to share anything to us saying, this is your school, not ours. What they're telling us is we've given opportunities. Score 3 is when you're proficient. Like I can count to 20, that's my score 3. But there's a score 4 on that, kids that choose to go above and beyond. And the kids will tell you, we went from being terrible at it, and they'll tell you that, and our teachers will say that, to they would say, you must be doing some work on this because teachers are getting really good at this. Or they'll say, hey, I really love the pathways that these teachers give me. And to a fault, they'll tell us, like, Dr. Steiner, they are trying so hard. Like he goes, nobody is trying to be traditional. Everybody is trying to take risks. They are asking us for our input. And for the first time, they're using it. That's a really like a smile moment for me to say, like, oh, that's a learner-led school. Is even some of our policies, we've had kids come up to us and say, 5 years ago, I never asked. This year they said, we don't like our dress code policy. It's not fair. And we said, all right, change it. So they organized with teachers and they organized a new dress code policy. Like, I think they would tell you that for the first time in a long time, they feel empowered. They will tell you that when they're not in school, they know that they can get themselves ahead a pace so they can plan if they're not going to be in there because they're going to miss for state volleyball, they're going on vacation. I think they will tell you that it's their school and they appreciate the fact that people respect and honor their opinions.
And as you and I talked about, certainly their school, people respect and honor their opinions, and it's self-paced, like you said. They can work ahead if somebody needs a little bit more time. They've got the ability to put that time in. Talk a little bit about the competency-based aspect of education.
Yeah, so for us, it's built around this idea of proficiency skills, which, I mean, people are doing. That's nothing new. Our score 3 is the standard. We literally write the standard on the scale, and then we're crystal clear with what it means for that standard to be achieved. And then when we look at like score 1s and score 2s, it might be that score 2 is on a taxonomy of just identify. So it might be identifying terms. It might be a traditional, like we're going to have to identify a vocab term. But ultimately, everything in terms of competence is built around our taxonomy, our Marzano taxonomy. So the idea of like, if you're at create, that's a pretty high level on the taxonomy. So if we're at create and that's what the standard is, then we're going to have to analyze multiple levels of evidence to get to a score 4. And it is this idea that getting to a mastery level or that competency level, there are different pathways and we require 3 pieces of evidence. And what I think it's important for people to understand is we don't convert. So we don't say, oh, you had an 80%, that's a 3. We don't have percentage or letter grades in our district for courses that we run. That was huge because that allowed us to focus on learning instead of getting work turned in the grade. And a test is the same as any other piece of evidence. You might choose. I just had a learner or an educator tell me kids can choose to take the test or they can choose to do a project or they can choose to tell me another way they want to do it. And I think that's competency based in a nutshell is they get to decide how they demonstrate that they've learned it.
Well, it frees up that student that maybe isn't the best textbook learner, but has other modes of learning and does just as well, maybe in some cases better, learning the way they learn to say, look, maybe teaching to the test isn't the best way or displaying my mastery of a certain subject isn't the best way to do that on a written test. It's, I can show you on this project, I can do this work-based learning experience that ties back to that same estimation of an individual's capabilities. And by doing so, you're really freeing that learner up and almost they're setting their own expectations. So rather than saying, you're going to pass this test, it's going to be, what does it mean to you to reach this expectation per the standard? And as long as that, is reasonable to the teacher or whoever is facilitating that learning, they're able to explore it that way. So it really frees up the learner to learn the way that they learn. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Matt. And I think the thing that always has bothered me about the traditional system is those kids you just described were failures in that system and have been for 100+ years and been okay with that. Like, I have kids that could take an engine out and fix it and restore it. And there's more math in that than anything I did in a traditional model. But we look at that as different. And I say the same thing and people get tired of me saying it. Like, so if a kid gets 61%, if that's passing. I don't want my doctor or my mechanic to get 61% of something right. I want to know they mastered it and they're proficient. So if we know that there's different ways to get to different ends or outcomes, why wouldn't we model that in our K-12 schools? So when they leave our K-12 schools, they can do that same thing.
Absolutely. It makes perfect sense to me. Did it make perfect sense to the community? Tell us about that journey and where you started and maybe some of the objections, Cory, you got when you disrupted education this way, and then maybe, where things sit today.
Yeah, when we first started this and had this idea, kind of this Jim Collins big, hairy, audacious goal, we went out to our communities and I posed a question to them and I said, on a sticky note, I just want you to write down what are your hopes and dreams for your kid. And we had good turnout at these meetings. And nobody put in their valedictorian. Nobody put in there a 4.0 GPA. Everybody, for the most part, put down like, I want a happy child. I want them to raise kids. I want them to give back to society. And I said, what if I tell you our current system, I can't guarantee any of that. But I said, what if you trusted us? And we had a lot of trust built up in our community to make a radical change, and you give us time and know we're going to make mistakes, but give us time to do this. The pushback, people were really worried about, is my kid going to get into college? Are they going to get scholarship? Because college isn't getting cheaper. Well, if you do this now, well, like, why would a kid even need to go to college? Like, do they even need that skill anymore? And they were just worried about this idea of like, it worked for me and it was working for my kid. And that was the key. It was working for kids, but I'm not sure it was. It was working for them in a traditional model of like, yeah, they were getting grades and they were moving to one grade level after another because they got a year older. But I don't know if it was really working for them as human beings. And I would say the grade thing, oh man, I've been called some pretty tough names, and I had some really tough conversations, not only with parents, but with kids who were really afraid of that their future would be impacted. And I think right now, if you are parents, I think a vast majority would tell you their kids have been given more opportunities than they've ever dreamed. Their kids have been given opportunities to spend half a day in an internship that they're getting paid on and getting credit for in school, and now know like they don't want to do that, which I think is sometimes more valuable than thinking an 18-year-old should know what they want to do. That they've gotten opportunities to go do things that they would have never gotten an opportunity in a traditional class. And then I think they'd also tell you that we've given every kid their first choice and an opportunity to reach that choice. And that, I think that's the thing I'm most proud of, is if they want to go military, they're getting our military expo day. They're getting this huge experience where they're exposed to that. If they want to go career, we are finding a place for them to intern and do that. Those kids that aren't sure and want to intern in the building, we're finding internships in the building. So I think that they would tell you the experiences they've had have been second to none.
And for the students or the parents that were concerned about a student's opportunity to go on to a four-year college, assuming that's the path that they choose, or to get the scholarships that they want to be eligible for to offset the cost of higher education, how has that worked out? Has that worked out for the better?
That has been an absolute non-issue. And we were scared right away, but we called it our road show. We went around to colleges and I remember we did this really, what we thought was a great presentation, and it was our local research university, North Dakota State, so 25 miles down the road. And we got done, we're like, will you accept this new model? And the admissions person looked at me and said, we take transcripts from like 20 different countries. We can figure a way to take one from 25 miles away. And I was like, oh,
that's awesome.
But then we also had to do some work. We went to the legislature and said, hey, the state scholarship says you have to have an A, B, or C. We want it changed to include proficiency. They're like, absolutely. We have an optional curriculum diploma where kids that might not do well in a traditional system can get a different looking diploma. Still counts as a major diploma. We got the legislation changed in that. So ultimately, what we have found is our kids are getting as many scholarships, if not more. But what we're finding out is when they're going into college, we have kids that are advocating and being able to have adult conversations with professors and with advisors that our kids weren't having before we started this shift.
Well, and probably a number of their contemporaries, as they get into higher education, then the others may not be able to have those kind of conversations, which really speaks to all this experience going through the educational process or the pathway of the work-based learning, of the project-based learning, and so on, and having to put to work your problem-solving skills, your communication skills, being comfortable in those kind of discussions. And the other thing I'm guessing is that when for those that do choose that higher education pathway, they probably have a much greater context for what they're learning when they get there. We talk about students that are perhaps learning industrial robots when they're in high school and then going on to a 4-year engineering pathway. And those students will tell you that they were way ahead of the other students who had just taken calculus, physics, and so on while they're going through their high school AP courses. And the students that got the hands-on experience had a greater context for what they were learning, not just in high school, but when they got to college. So I think, again, just for those that choose that path, and there are many great paths as we leave secondary education. So, we talked about the students, we talked about the communities. As somebody who led manufacturing companies like I did for 20 plus years, I know that no change happens without some form of the team getting excited around it and coming along. In your case, your faculty and your administration. Let's speak specifically about members of the faculty and what this transition was like for them, what you heard from them early on, and then how they've managed to adapt to the new model.
Yeah, the first thing we did when we brought this idea to them was we did the old T-chart on a piece of paper, and we said, why can we do this and why can't we? And then we categorized it. And what we found out is why can't we was 3 pages longer than why can't we. And the why can'ts were almost all adult preference. And so then we said, we're not doing consensus, but we said, can we commit to making small gains over the years, looking at models that work, adjusting for what works for us, and doing this work. And it's going to be hard, and it's going to be difficult, and it's going to be tough, and you're going to be burnt out at times. But can we do it? And what I will say is, and I'm not saying this just because I'm talking to you. I've got the most remarkable group of risk takers I have ever worked with in my career. Like they value it. They're so willing to try to do things differently for kids, even though like it's scary. Like there's a lot of fear that goes with this work. And I think I shared with you, we had it happen probably 2-3 years into it. We had a crash moment. We had people saying, I'm not coming back after Christmas break. And so we basically, and we had people write down, we said, share with the person that you are most, like who you believe in the most, who you care for the most, share with them what's going on with you. What are your fears? And the part that was amazing is we did that. And then we said, what can we do with quick wins and losses? And we talked to some people from the mental health world. And what they had shared with us was people were experiencing grief. There was a of loss because of they had been doing this work a certain way and had been doing it well, but then that they needed to change that. And so when we got through that, we've recognized there are times when we have to stop pushing. There are times when we can push a little harder. It's turned our professional learning model to one that used to be us telling them to them identifying their own professional learning and what they need. And I think the other thing it is that like there's a lot of times you'll hear our people say like they don't ever feel good enough, like they're not good enough. And I tell them that they are good enough. What that feeling is understanding that when you truly get in a model that's about continuous improvement, you never feel quite satisfied or at ease. But I also know if you talk to people and you said, we'll go back to the traditional model, a vast majority of our people would say absolutely not, because they've seen such amazing things. And I'll say, I've seen teachers become facilitators of learning, which is our ultimate goal. And I've seen them become leaders in ways that they don't have to be a principal or a superintendent, that they have led in their learning centers. We get lots of visitors and people that come in and watch, and they're so proud of what they've accomplished and should be. It's not easy to transform a system. And has it been bumpy? Really, really bumpy. Like, I hope nobody ever thinks like, oh, we'll do this and it'll go really smooth. There will be moments when it's easier to turn and run, but the persistence of our group and the resilience of our people in our building, I really believe is second to none, or we wouldn't be where we're at without their commitment to this.
Yeah, commitment is everything, and there's so many different directions we can go with that. Last discussion, you think about the mental health aspect of changing something in an organization and the grief that goes along with that. I never thought of it in that context, but certainly that that same process of losing something that you cared about, that you loved, that was a part of you, and having to go on. I can certainly see the parallels there. I remember a mentor telling me one time when we were talking about change management. He said that a leader's job in change management, and it really reflects, I think, what you just discussed, is to push when you need to push, to pull when you need to pull, to give them a hug when they need a hug, and having the wisdom to know which to do when. And I always love that answer. Hey, one other story that just occurred to me as you were going through that, I remember with regard to continuous improvement, and in this case, in a manufacturing context where I spent all my time. I remember sitting one day with a vice president of operations and members of our team following the best month we had ever had. So we just absolutely blew the doors off the place. Financial performance, best month we had ever had in history. We celebrated it in our staff meeting on a Monday morning, and then I was like, all right, now how are we going to make this month better? And he looked at me and he's like, when will it ever be enough? And I was like, never. It's like, that's what continuous improvement is, right? I mean, we signed up for this. It's just, all right, now we just set a new standard and we have to figure out where we go from there. Speaking of setting a new standard, which you certainly have done in education, I would love to hear, Cory, how that new standard has created some success stories for your students. You've shared a couple of them with us as they were going through, their K-12 process and journey. Maybe touched on a little bit what happened in the four-year colleges, but tell us a few success stories, if you have them, of what this has done for your students.
I just had one the other day. We just hired a former grad to come back and teach for us. And they sat in that room, and when they said, why did you want to go into teaching? They said, well, I did, and I was going to go into nursing. But you guys allowed me to intern with the preschool teachers, and I saw the difference that they made in the lives of those kids. I wanted to be them. And like, we just hired that person. Like, that's because we didn't say, well, no, you need to be in this math class, or you need to be in this elective class. We said, no, you can go spend a couple hours in the preschool room and work with our littlest learners. Had a learner who was really close to not graduating, and it was an issue of not that they couldn't write, but they hated to write because they wanted to write about things they were passionate about. And so with about 6 weeks left in school, we said, what do you want to write about? He's like, I want to write about farming. And we said, all right, but you got to write about farming and try to become a published author. And they did. And again, like in that instance, we would have said, well, you don't graduate, and then you'll have to come back and redo these assignments. Like, again, which makes no sense, because they completed a whole host of the work and just needed this small little standard left. We've seen that part. I think what I will tell you, I've seen in like our little learners, because people always say, well, easy to do in high school, easy to do in middle school. Actually, I think it's more difficult because you've got a lot more habits to try to break in those ages. But like, I mean, I sat in a preschool room, and I had a kid tell me, I'm learning this because it's best for me, and my friend's learning this because it's best for them. And that was okay. They were doing two different things, and there was no competition about that. And we've seen some behaviors with kids that when we give them choices, and not just choices of like A or B, but like, hey, tell me how you want to do this. We've seen behaviors start to change. And again, I tell people the success of our system will be based on, did we create quality human beings when they're probably about 25 to 30 years old? Yeah, scores go up. I hope those things do well. There's some of those metrics we're always going to have to answer for. But like, if we have a system designed the right way that learners and adults are allowed to work together to become the best version of themselves, I think that's the success story. And we surveyed our kids, a bunch of our former grads, and in that it was like, I got to be treated as a human being. I heard what other people went through in their schools. I got to make choices. Now when I'm in college, I'm making choices. When I chose to go to work, I didn't feel like a failure. Like, I mean, think about, and this is what I always tell our staff, like, just because something's hard is not evidence it's wrong. This was hard work, but we're starting to see not just the kids we have, but the kids who have left, who are coming back to us and saying, thank you. Thank you for trusting me. And the final thing we do, like one of our grad requirements, is a capstone. And that capstone it used to be a where they have to share the story of how they got through high school. And it was brutal, because they would get there and say, I got an A in calculus because I handled all my work in. And I mean, I'd sit there and be like, I don't want to sit in these. And so we changed it completely. And we said, can you just tell the story of how you became who you are, and talk if the school helped play a role in that, share that. But if not, tell us who you are and why. It is the greatest day every year, every single year. I mean, and you'll see teachers coming out with red eyes, and parents with red eyes, and people hugging, and military people that come to these because they've been invited to come for the kids going into the military. So like, the success, it's there, and it's so wide reaching right now. It's tough sometimes to even put it into stories. I could give you 100 more stories, but like, the people it's created, that's the part that I'm so excited about.
Well, it's so heartwarming and inspiring and really just invigorating to hear you talk about it in that fashion. Cory, 5 years in now, you've had all these success stories. I'm sure that, some of those initial hurdles of getting through the change management with every single one of your stakeholders, I mean, you're always going to have some of that, but I'm sure that's getting a little bit better. Do you still have the people that look at you and say, we kind of doubt whether this is working or maybe we need to go back to the old model?
Yeah, I don't think I don't think we have a ton of that in our school. We certainly have people that will question decisions we make, question like the next thing we're going to do. And I think that's a really good thing. I'm glad they feel empowered to do it, because we shouldn't just keep doing, like you said, don't do change for the sake of change. But it's that idea of like, when is enough enough? Never. I tell them that, like, if I don't continue to keep pushing you, and if our principals don't continue to keep pushing me, then like it means we've given up faith that we can grow and get better. And I just don't believe that. So, but yeah, we do. We still have some people, and we have some people in our state that say like, well, it's for show. And I have some parents who say this is just for show. And it is not. Like this. It would have been easier to just continue sending 95% of our kids to four-year college and just keep doing what we're doing. The part that people need to understand, that think that this isn't right, is just talk to your kids and ask them. Ask them if they're engaged. Ask them their friends. We surveyed our kids 4 years into the transition. Last spring, we surveyed our 6 through 12 learners. 35% said they were engaged. It was heartbreaking. We couldn't believe it. And so we talked this year about engagement and giving more choice. And we surveyed our kids. Did we give you more choice, more direction this year? That went from 45% to over 70%. And the engagement part went from 35% to nearly 65%. And it's no coincidence that when we give kids more choices, they feel more engaged. So when people push back and say, this isn't the right thing to do, then ask the kids what's the right thing to do. And if they say, keep doing what you're doing, then keep doing it. But that's not what our kids were telling us. And it's not even really what our business world, what the workforce was telling us. They were telling us that something has to change. And I tell it, like, we host a big institute. We have it next week. And I will stand in front of them and say, like, all right, you've been to this institute. Like, are you going to do something about it? Like, I'm tired of people talking about it. I'm growing weary of that. I'm tired of people saying, well, COVID should have changed it, but it didn't. And so it's going to take it up on the next set of risk takers in this country to start to seriously make change in this system.
So when you think about that next set of risk takers and the example that you've set, Cory, for education in general, especially K-12 education, I've got to believe you have, in as much as you've got some institutions that are looking at it and saying, hey, was this the right decision? You have to have others that are coming to you and saying, wow, this is really, really innovative. Tell us about what it is that you're doing. So certainly you're going to have people emulating this model, I'm guessing. Have you seen some of that? And then, 10 years from now, do you think we'll see this model proliferate beyond Northern Cass and maybe the handful of early adopters into a much more accepted way of educating our students?
Yeah, I mean, right now, one of our biggest school districts, our second biggest, West Fargo, is doing some of this work. Oaks, a district our size, is, and even our youth correctional center is doing this work right now. So there are some school districts that are venturing in. And I think you would find that there's a lot of educators in classrooms in buildings that are doing some very innovative things, very similar to what we're doing. Because when we share and people see it, they're like, oh, I'm doing that. And I'll say, yeah, you are doing those pieces. You've got to do it consistently, and you've got to start doing it systemically. Once that happens, that shift will occur. But in 10 years, I'm cautiously optimistic. And I tell people in North Dakota right now, we have a beautiful, perfect storm. We have a superintendent of public instruction, Kirsten Basler, and a governor, Governor Burgum, who are very reform-minded. And honestly, anybody who says there's a barrier to doing things in North Dakota, I will tell them they're not right. The barriers have been taken away and reduced. Any barrier we have is more a federal level. There might be some hoops we have to jump through, but in terms of the barriers for innovation, there are very few, if any. And so I think in 10 years, I do believe we're going to see some significant change where this model will have taken a hold and become more of the norm than like, oh, there's 5 schools doing this. I think we're going to really see it happen. I'm very optimistic about that.
And let that be a lesson, I think, for public policymakers and leaders across the country as they think about their futures. And what you just said, which is, and I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, the more barriers you can remove that stand in the way of innovation, the more innovation you're going to have, and the further ahead we're going to get, the more continuous improvement we're going to have in education, the more we're going to be able to respond to the needs of the marketplace, the changing worlds of technology and education and data and all the things that go along with that. And most important, the changing ways that we need to meet our learners, this next generation of the workforce, this next generation of leaders. So certainly a great message there in terms of the importance of identifying and removing barriers so that we can continue to grow and continue to improve and continue to disrupt, which is the nature of the next question, which is, all right, we've done all these great things over 5 years. We've got these great student experiences, but you and I have already committed to continuous improvement. We can't rest on our laurels and say we're done or this is enough. As you look out into the future, Cory, what does the future disruption in the world of K-12 education look like?
It's a great question, and it's a big question. I think that one of the big things, I think there's a couple things I'm seeing coming down the road. I think one is states are having more conversation about the Carnegie unit and that it really doesn't make any sense. And I use the example, I shared it with you. I had a daughter who needed probably 18 weeks to do Algebra 2. I had a daughter who needed about 40 weeks. They both got 36. That's ludicrous. That makes no sense. And so if we can get rid of the Carnegie unit and be okay with this idea of like proficiency or competency based being there, then it takes away that one thing that everybody always says, time. Well, we have to have seat time. The Carnegie unit is what's held that to be true. I believe like if we can attack that and states go after that, that could be the opening for the next disruption of reimagining the high school experience. Because the high school experience should be really about experiences. You know, ultimately, any kid that goes to a 4-year college gets to experience high school twice because they experience high school, and then the next 2 years, they do the exact same coursework. And tell me that's not true from higher ed, but the ones that are honest will tell you it's absolutely true. And so that next disruption has to be that idea of the college is sitting down with us and saying, all right, they don't need those 2 years. Show me that they know this material. Let's have that conversation. And then let's get them into the workforce sooner if that's the path they choose. But then the other part that it is the next disruption is like the expansion of CTE has to occur, and it has to occur sooner than later. And we can do that by changing the paradigm in K-8, where we start giving kids choices and we scaffold that up to the point where they're owning their learning by 8th grade. And they come into 9th grade with coaching and can make choices on their own.
Absolutely. Not an episode, it seems, of the Tech Ed podcast goes by that we don't say that the number one influencer of a young person's career pathway are their own interests and experiences in middle school and high school, and to your point, even before that. And that is just so important to give them those experiences while they're going through that process. I, of course, am a huge fan of proficiency and competency-based learning. Like anything else in life, it shouldn't matter the time it took to get somewhere. What matters is what you have and can do once you're through with that path. And we all have different areas of expertise and things we gravitate toward. And if I'm really good at something and struggle with something else, fine, give me the extra time to work on what I struggle on. If that's important to me and to my education, and let me, whiz through the part that I can grasp right away. And we all have those areas. And that's just a much more efficient way of looking at education. That's the way we need to disrupt education. And I think, you and I certainly think the same way on so many of these topics, which is why it's so much fun to spend time with you. Unfortunately, that time is slowly coming to an end, or perhaps quickly coming to an end. It's amazing how fast our time together is gone. I do want to pose one last question, Cory, to you. And that question is this. Let's go back in time. Let's go back to that 15-year-old Cory Steiner, and your whole life is ahead of you, and you're a sophomore in high school, give or take, probably learning in a much different model than your students are learning in today. But if you could give one piece of advice, Cory, to that young individual, that young Cory Steiner, what would that piece of advice be?
I think the piece of advice I would give to them is, it is their education. It is yours. It is, you own it. Not the school does not. They do not get to give it to you. You get to receive. You get to design your own path. Go do that. Like, I wish I would have said that and said, go own what you want and what you need, and be relentless in making sure you get it, because they're capable of it. And maybe I wasn't at 15, but our 15-year-olds now are, I always said, they are one of the greatest generations I've ever seen. They are brilliant and remarkable. It just looks different than what brilliance and remarkability looked like when I grew up. So it is your education. You get to decide the path it should go.
and that advice you would have given the 15-year-old Cory Steiner, you are now every single day giving, and not just giving, but creating an environment in which they can enjoy those choices, enjoy those decisions, own their education pathway in a way that's way more invigorating. It is way more effectualizing in terms of understanding where they are today and where they want to go. And I'm sure it's tremendously motivating for your students and for the entire community there in Northern Cass. Dr. Cory Steiner, the superintendent of Northern Cass School District, has been our guest here, my guest on the Tech Ed podcast. We've had a crazily informative discussion about the world of disruption, about the world of continuous improvement, about how we can look to a new way of educating the next generation of young people in a way that is incredibly engaging for them. This last hour, Cory, has been incredibly engaging for me. I want to thank you for spending some time with me here on the Tech Ed podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for elevating our story of a school in the middle of nowhere, but one that is doing some really remarkable things with remarkable learners, community members, families, and educators.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you liked this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.